The ballroom of Lord and Lady Granville's
I have
townhouse
made my decision.
blazed with the honeyed light of 500 beeswax candles, their
I
flames
understand your
reflected in the
position.
polished parquet like fallen stars. Miss Helena Thornton stood at the edge of that shimmering world, her back pressed to a fluted column, a cup of lukewarm ratafia balanced in her gloved hand. She had been in London for nearly 3 months, and in that time she had perfected the art of being present without being perceived. Her aunt, Mrs. Haverford, had long since abandoned the effort of introducing her to eligible gentlemen. Helena's dowry was modest, her connections unremarkable, and her face, while pleasing in its quiet symmetry, lacked the vivacious sparkle that drew gentlemen across crowded rooms. She watched her cousins, Rose and Lydia, twirl through the figures of a country dance, their laughter floating above the string quartet like birdsong. No one watched her. That was the peculiar gift of wallflowers. They saw everything. It was how she noticed Lady Margaret Ashworth. The girl could not have been more than 17, her gown a shade of pale primrose that washed out her already delicate complexion. She stood near the refreshment table, her posture a study in withdrawal, shoulders curved, chin dipped, fingers worrying the edge of her fan. Encircling her were three young ladies Helena recognized as the sort who sharpened their tongues on those they deemed beneath them. And beside them, lounging with the indolent grace of a predator, stood Viscount Stapleton. "Really, Lady Margaret," one of the young ladies drawled, her voice pitched to Carrie, "I cannot fathom why your brother bothers to bring you out. You stand there as mute as a chapel mouse. Do you even know how to speak?" The others tittered. Stapleton's mouth curved into a lazy smirk. "Perhaps the lady requires encouragement, a bit of champagne, a turn about the room with a gentleman who knows how to coax a conversation." He stepped closer, and Margaret flinched. Helena's fingers tightened on her cup. She had spent years in the country, caring for an ailing father until his death, and she knew the scent of cruelty the way a sailor knows the shift of wind before a squall. She saw the Duke of Ashford across the ballroom, a tall, imposing figure in dark evening clothes, his profile severe, his attention fixed on some political conversation with an aging earl. He did not glance at his sister. He did
Subscribe
not
to
seem
Whisper
to
of the
notice
Heart to
anything
never
at
miss a
all.
story.
Something in Helena's chest pulled taut. She had been the girl overlooked. She had been the one shrinking while others laughed. And she had promised herself, on the long carriage ride to London, that she would never again stand silent while someone else was made to feel small. She set down her glass and moved. Her approach was unhurried, her expression placid, as though she had merely wandered over to sample the lemon biscuits. She positioned herself directly between Margaret and the Viscount, a maneuver executed with such gentle, unassuming precision that the group fell momentarily silent from sheer surprise. "Good evening, Lady Margaret," Helena said, her voice warm but measured. "I have been hopping to make your acquaintance. I believe we share a fondness for the botanical prints at Hatchard's. I saw you admiring the same folio I had been eyeing for a fortnight." It was a fabrication, but a kind one. Margaret's startled eyes met hers, and something like relief flickered there. "Oh, yes, the wild flowers of Devonshire." Stapleton's smirk did not falter, but his gaze sharpened on Helena. "And who might you be? I do not believe we have been introduced." "We have not," Helena replied evenly, "and I find the pattern of our current conversation suggests that may be for the best." One of the young ladies gasped. The other two exchanged confused glances. Stapleton's expression flickered, amusement warring with a pinprick of indignation. "I beg your pardon." Helena turned her shoulder just enough to shield Margaret from his direct line of sight. "I am simply observing that gentlemen of quality do not typically surround a young lady like hounds around a hare, but perhaps my understanding of good society is outdated. I have been away from town for some time." The insult was veiled in silk, yet it drew blood. Stapleton's smile thinned. The debutantes, suddenly uncertain, began to drift back, their instinct for scandal warning them that a scene was brewing. Margaret's hand found Helena's wrist and held on, trembling. Across the ballroom, the Duke of Ashford turned his head. He had not heard the words, the distance and the music saw to that, but he had seen the shift in the room's geometry, the little cluster of mockery breaking apart. A woman he did not recognize, dressed in a gown of muted lavender that spoke of careful economy, standing like a sentinel before his sister. The Viscount's retreat, Margaret's shoulders lifting just slightly as though a weight had been eased. The Duke's eyes, gray as winter slate, narrowed with something he had not felt in a long while, curiosity, and beneath it a faint, unwelcome flicker of shame. He did not approach, not yet, but for the remainder of the evening his gaze kept drifting back to the woman in lavender, who did not seem to notice, or care, that one of the most powerful men in England was watching her. She simply stood with his sister, speaking in quiet tones, and let the ballroom whirl on without her. Part 2. The summons came the following afternoon, in the form of a crisp white card delivered by a footman in the Duke of Ashford's livery. Mrs. Haverford nearly dropped her teacup. Rose and Lydia erupted into a frenzy of speculation that bordered on hysteria. Helena, seated by the window with a book she had not been reading, felt a cold trickle of apprehension slide down her spine. The Duke's residence in Mayfair was everything her aunt's cramped townhouse was not, vast, hushed, and immaculate as a mausoleum. A butler conducted her to a drawing-room decorated in shades of blue and silver, where Lady Margaret sat on a settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She rose the moment Helena entered. "Miss Thornton, I asked my brother to arrange this. I hope you do not mind." Helena took the girl's hands. "I do not mind at all. Are you quite well?" Before Margaret could answer, a door opened and the Duke strode in. He was taller than Helena had realized, and the force of his presence seemed to alter the very air in the room. His dark hair was brushed back from a high forehead, his jaw clean-shaven, and set with an arrogance that looked almost architectural. He wore his title like a suit of armor, polished, impenetrable, and utterly without warmth. "Miss Thornton, I am Julian Ashworth." He did not bow so much as incline his head. "I wish to thank you for your intervention last evening. My sister speaks highly of you." "Your sister is a delight," Helena replied, releasing Margaret's hands but not stepping back. "I merely offered her conversation. The intervention was incidental." The Duke's gaze flickered. He was accustomed to gratitude of a more effusive variety. "Nevertheless, you acted where others did not. I am in your debt." Helena studied him for a long moment, the rigid bearing, the cool distance in his eyes. She thought of Margaret's trembling hand, the way the Viscount had circled like a wolf, and the Duke's oblivious figure across the ballroom. Something hot and sharp rose in her throat. "Your debt is easily discharged, Your Grace," she said. "Pay closer attention to your sister. The ton is not kind to those who stand alone." A muscle tightened in his jaw. "I am aware of the ton's nature." "Awareness without action," Helena said quietly, "is simply observation, and observation does not shield anyone from harm." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret's eyes went wide. The Duke's expression did not change, but something shuddered behind it, a flinch swiftly concealed. He was not accustomed to being spoken to in such a manner, least of all by a woman of no rank, no fortune, and no apparent desire to flatter him. "I shall take your counsel under advisement," he said at last, his tone as dry as ash. Helena inclined her head with the same minimal deference he had shown her, and the gesture was not lost on him. "Then my visit has served its purpose. Lady Margaret, I hope you will call on me whenever you wish." She curtsied, not prettily but with a simple, unadorned dignity, and took her leave. The Duke watched her go, the soft lavender of her gown dissolving into the shadows of the corridor. His mind, ordinarily preoccupied with matters of estate and politics, kept snagging on the quiet steel of her voice. She had not simpered. She had not angled for his favor. She had looked at him and seen with uncomfortable clarity the gap between his power and his neglect. Over the following weeks, he began to notice her everywhere. At the theater, seated in a modest box with her overdressed cousins, her profile still and thoughtful as the actors declaimed below. In Hyde Park, walking alone while her aunt gossiped on a bench, her bonnet ribbons fluttering like lavender banners. And always, Margaret found her way to Helena's side, a fact that struck the Duke as both reassuring and strangely unsettling. One afternoon, at a garden party hosted by Lady Sefton, the Duke observed a young man approach Helena with an easy, open smile. He recognized him as Mr. Theodore Finch, a gentleman of respectable fortune and famously warm disposition. Finch offered Helena a glass of lemonade with an unfeigned eagerness that made something in the Duke's chest tighten. Helena laughed at something Finch said, a soft, genuine sound the Duke had never heard from her, and he felt that tightening twist into something sharper. He turned away before he could be caught staring, but the image lingered and it irritated him in ways he could not justify. She was nobody, a country miss with a sharp tongue and a dowry that barely bought bonnet ribbons, and yet she had made him feel what, assessed, found wanting. The Duke of Ashford was not a man who tolerated being found wanting. That evening, he instructed his secretary to arrange a formal call upon the Haverford household. He told himself it was for Margaret's sake. Part 3. Mrs. Haverford's drawing room, with its faded chintz and overcrowded mantelpiece, seemed to shrink when the Duke of Ashford stepped into it. Rose and Lydia curtsied so deeply they nearly toppled. Their mother fluttered like a moth caught in a jar, offering tea, cake, ratafia, a tour of her modest garden, anything to prolong the miracle of a duke in her parlor. Helena entered last, and the Duke noted the fractional hesitation in her step. She had not expected him. Good. He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness. "Miss Thornton, a word if I may." It was not a request. Mrs. Haverford practically shoved her niece forward. "Of course, your grace. Helena, do attend his lordship. We shall give you privacy." They retreated into an adjoining room, though the rustle of skirts near the door suggested their departure was more theoretical than actual. Helena stood before the empty hearth, her hands clasped, her expression guarded. "You disapprove of me," the Duke said without preamble. "I do not know you well enough to disapprove," Helena replied. "I disapprove of certain actions, or, in some cases, inactions." "You speak of my sister." "I speak of a girl who is drowning in plain sight, while her only protector polishes his political connections." The bluntness landed like a slap. The Duke's eyes narrowed. "You presume much for someone with no understanding of my responsibilities." "I understand that you shield her by keeping her cloistered, and then leave her exposed the moment she steps into society. That is not protection. That is negligence dressed in good intentions." He took a step closer, and the space between them crackled with a tension that was not entirely anger. "You think me negligent. I think you have grown so accustomed to wielding power that you have forgotten how to wield care," Helena said. "Lady Margaret is not a fragile ornament to be locked in a cabinet. She needs to learn to navigate the world, not hide from it. And she needs a brother who notices when she is being hunted." The word hunted struck something raw in the Duke's chest. He thought of Stapleton's circling presence, the knowing smirk, the way Margaret had flinched. He had noticed after the fact. He had reacted, but he had not prevented. "I am aware," he said, his voice quieter now, "that I have not been as vigilant as I ought. Your plain speaking is discomfiting, but not unwelcome." Helena's eyes searched his face. Whatever she found there made her own expression soften by the faintest degree. "Then there is hope for you yet, your grace." He might have smiled. He was not sure. The impulse was so unfamiliar that it startled him. Before he could form a reply, a footman entered with a salver bearing a letter. The Duke recognized Margaret's hurried script. The footman murmured that it had just arrived for Miss Thornton. Helena took the note, her brow furrowing as she read. The Duke watched her face pale, saw her lips press into a thin line. "What is it?" She hesitated, then met his gaze squarely. "Your sister has begged my assistance. She says there is a matter she cannot bring to you, a matter of some delicacy." The Duke's heart kicked against his ribs. What manner of matter? She did not say. Helena folded the letter with careful precision. "But I will go to her, and when I understand the situation I will advise her, even if that advice is to trust you with the truth." She moved toward the door and the Duke caught her wrist. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it froze them both. "If my sister is in danger," he said, his voice low and rough, "I will hold myself accountable, but I will also hold whoever threatens her to a reckoning they will not forget." Helena looked down at his hand, then up at his face. "Then perhaps, your grace, you might start by earning her trust, so she does not have to send letters to near strangers." She pulled free, gently but firmly, and walked out of the drawing room. The Duke stood motionless, the ghost of her warmth still lingering on his fingers. For the first time in years, he felt the awful, humbling weight of his own failings, and the startling realization that one quiet woman had seen them all along. Part 4. Green Park lay under a gauze of high cloud, the morning light soft as brushed wool. Helena found Margaret seated on a bench near the reservoir, her face pale and her hands twisting a handkerchief into knots. The girl rose at Helena's approach, and with a stifled sob, pressed a crumpled stack of letters into her hands. They were written on heavy cream paper, the penmanship bold and self-assured. Lord Stapleton's words unfurled with a nauseating mix of flattery and veiled threat. He claimed to be bewitched by Margaret's shyness. He promised to cure her of it. He suggested, with oily ambiguity, that a private meeting would benefit them both, and that refusal might lead to unfortunate misunderstandings about her character. "He cornered me at Lady Sefton's musicale," Margaret whispered. "He said if I did not meet him in the library during the interval, he would let it be known that I had encouraged him. No one would believe me over a viscount, and Julian would be furious. He would demand satisfaction, and there would be a duel, and everything would be ruined." Helena folded the letters and tucked them into her reticule. The gesture was calm, but inside she felt a cold, clarifying fury. "You will not meet him. You will not answer his letters, and you will not protect your brother from the consequences of a scoundrel's actions, but I will help you." Margaret stared. "How?" "There is a musicale at the Allens this Thursday. Stapleton will be there. So will I, and when he seeks you out, he will find me instead." They arranged the details in hushed voices, unaware that 20 yards away, behind a screen of lime trees, the Duke of Ashford stood with his hands clenched at his sides. He had followed Margaret's carriage, consumed by a dread he could not name. He had not intended to spy, but the sight of those letters, even from a distance, had turned his blood to ice. On Thursday evening, Helena arrived at the Allens' townhouse with her heart beating a steady, deliberate rhythm. She wore her lavender gown, her only armor. Margaret sat trembling beside her in the music room, the notes of a soprano's aria weaving through the candle-lit air. At the interval, Stapleton appeared as though conjured, his smile sharp and proprietary as he leaned over Margaret's chair. "Lady Margaret, I trust you received my correspondence." Helena stood. "Lord Stapleton, a word if you please." She led him not to the library but to the open terrace beyond the French windows, where the cool evening air and the presence of other guests offered safety. The Viscount followed with visible impatience. "What is the meaning of this?" Helena turned to face him, her voice pitched low and steady. "The meaning is that Lady Margaret will not be meeting you, privately or otherwise. The letters you sent her have been preserved. If you approach her again, if you speak her name with anything less than complete respect, those letters will be placed in the hands of men whose honor does not permit them to ignore such things." Stapleton's smile vanished. "You would not dare, who would credit the word of a wallflower and a frightened child." "I am not a child," Margaret said, stepping through the doors behind Helena. Her voice shook, but her chin was lifted. "And Miss Thornton is the truest friend I have ever known. Leave us." The Viscount took a step forward, his expression darkening. "You insolent little—" He did not finish. A figure emerged from the shadowed terrace beyond, the Duke, his face pale with tightly leashed violence. He placed himself between the Viscount and the women, his shoulders broad and his presence utterly commanding. "Stapleton, you will leave this house at once. You will leave London by week's end. If I so much as hear your name spoken in connection with my sister, I will ensure your reputation is reduced to ash and your person barred from every decent drawing-room in England. Do you understand me?" The Viscount's mouth worked. He looked from the Duke's unyielding face to Helena's steady eyes to Margaret's trembling but resolute form. Then, without a word, he turned and strode into the night. Silence fell. The distant strains of the soprano drifted through the open doors. Margaret burst into tears and threw her arms around her brother. The Duke held her, his eyes meeting Helena over his sister's shoulder. There was no arrogance in his gaze now, only something raw, unguarded, and profoundly grateful. "Miss Thornton," he said, his voice rough, "I owe you more than words can settle." Helena's own composure felt suddenly fragile. "You owe me nothing, your grace. I did what any decent person would do." He shook his head slowly. "No, you did what I failed to do again." He released Margaret gently and took a step toward Helena. The space between them seemed to hum. "I have been blind and proud and unforgivably careless. You opened my eyes, I will not forget it." Helena did not look away. "See that you do not, your grace." And there, on the moon-washed terrace, something shifted, not in him alone, but between them. A recognition. A crack in the armor he had worn for so long. He did not know what to call it. He only knew that when she turned and walked back into the music room, the air felt colder for her absence. Part 5. The scandal, when it broke, was not the one anyone expected. The Duke moved swiftly and silently in the days following the musicale, and Lord Stapleton departed London under a cloud of rumor that never quite clarified into public disgrace. The Duke, for Margaret's sake, had chosen discretion over annihilation. But the whispers of a near ruin and a mysterious intervention swirled through drawing-rooms like smoke, and at the center of that haze stood Miss Helena Thornton. Invitations that had once passed her by began to arrive with flattering frequency. Callers she had never met left cards at her aunt's door. Rose and Lydia were alternately delighted and bewildered. Mrs. Haverford purchased 3 new gowns and spoke of our dear Helena's prospects with breathless avarice. Helena hated it. She had not sought the attention, and she distrusted its sudden warmth. The ton, she knew, was a weather vane. It turned with the wind, and the wind could change at any moment. The Duke, however, seemed determined to anchor her in place. He appeared at every event she attended, his tall figure cutting through the crowds with an ease that made other gentlemen step aside. He asked her to dance at the Harcourt's ball, and the room around them seemed to hold its breath as he led her onto the floor. "You are staring at me," Helena said as the violins began a waltz. "I am," he admitted. I find I cannot seem to stop. That is likely the novelty, she replied. You have never noticed me before. The shine will wear off. His hand at her waist tightened fractionally. You think so little of my constancy. I think, Your Grace, that you are a man who values rarity. Once I become familiar, I suspect your interest will fade. The music carried them in a slow, sweeping turn. His gray eyes held hers. You are determined to think the worst of me. I am determined to think clearly of you. There is a difference. He let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. Fair enough. I have given you cause for caution, but I am not a man who abandons what he values, and I value you, Miss Thornton, more than I can easily express. The words hung between them, heavy and startling. Helena's step faltered, and he steadied her with a gentle pressure. She felt the warmth of his hand through her glove, the solid certainty of his presence. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a world in which this man, proud, difficult, slowly thawing, might truly see her. Then the waltz ended, and Mr. Theodore Finch was at her elbow, his cheerful face creased with concern. Miss Thornton, I've secured that carriage ride you promised me. Tomorrow, if the weather holds. Hyde Park, 2:30. Helena agreed, mostly to escape the intensity of the Duke's gaze. But as she walked away on Mr. Finch's arm, she felt the Duke's eyes on her back like a brand. He did not follow, but the jealousy that coiled in his chest was a living thing, hot and unfamiliar. He had never been jealous before. He had never cared enough. Now, watching the amiable Mr. Finch bend his head toward Helena's bonnet, he cared fiercely, and he had no earthly idea what to do about it. Part 6. The scandal sheet appeared on a gray Tuesday morning, slipped beneath doors and unfolded over breakfast tables across Mayfair. Its anonymous author had constructed a masterpiece of insinuation. Miss H.T., it claimed, had orchestrated a scheme to ingratiate herself with a certain Duke's vulnerable sister, engineering a false crisis to secure the Duke's gratitude, and ultimately, his proposal. The piece stopped short of naming names, but every reader in London knew exactly who was meant. Helena read it at her dressing table, her hands perfectly steady, her expression unchanging. Rose wept. Lydia raged. Mrs. Haverford took to her bed with a vial of smelling salts. The invitation stopped. The callers vanished. The Tun, as Helena had always known it would, turned its back. She waited for the Duke to act. He came to the house that afternoon, his face a mask of strain. In the same drawing room where he had once challenged her, he now stood before her with a hesitation that spoke louder than any declaration. I will make this right, he said, but I must be careful. If I am too forceful, I risk drawing more attention to Margaret's situation. Stapleton's allies will seize on any weakness. Helena looked at him, and she saw the calculation behind his words. It was not coldness. She understood that. It was the instinct of a man who had spent a lifetime protecting his name and his family from the world's teeth. But understanding did not ease the ache that bloomed beneath her ribs. You are asking me to be patient, she said quietly, to endure the whispers while you manage the narrative. I am asking you to trust me. Trust, Helena repeated. She rose from her chair, her lavender skirts settling around her like calm water. Trust is not a strategy, Your Grace. It is a gift, and you are still deciding whether I am worth the cost of accepting it. His jaw tightened. That is not. You hesitated, she said, and the words were soft but unyielding. When the scandal broke, you hesitated. I saw it. I felt it. And I cannot build a future on the foundation of a man's uncertainty. She walked past him toward the garden door. He caught her arm, not roughly, but with a desperation that stilled her steps. Helena. It was the first time he had spoken her Christian name. She closed her eyes against the sound of it. I am not a prize to be claimed when the odds are favorable, she said. I am not a wallflower waiting to be plucked. I have spent too many years invisible to be seen only when it suits another's convenience. If you want me, Julian Ashworth, you will have to risk something. You will have to stand before the ton and declare without equivocation that you believe in me. Not because it is strategic, because it is true. She pulled free and stepped into the garden. The door clicked shut behind her. The Duke stood alone in the fading light, her absence a wound he had no words to dress. Part 7. 3 days later, the Duke of Ashford walked into the crowded salon of Lady Jersey's afternoon gathering and committed an act of social suicide. Or rather, what would have been social suicide for a lesser man? For a duke of his stature, it was merely unprecedented honesty. He did not whisper. He did not pull influential matrons aside for quiet words. He stood in the center of the room, his voice carrying with the practiced clarity of a man who had addressed Parliament, and he spoke the truth. Lord Stapleton had attempted to compromise his sister. Miss Helena Thornton had intervened at great personal risk. The scandal sheet's accusations were false, planted by a disgruntled party seeking to destroy an innocent woman's reputation. And he, the Duke, intended to marry Miss Thornton, if she would have him. The silence that followed was not the awed hush of romance, but the stunned quiet of a world recalibrating. Then the whispers began. But they were different now, curious, reassessing. A few ladies nodded, several gentlemen murmured approval. The tide, so recently turned against Helena, began its slow reversal. The Duke did not stay to savor his victory. He went directly to the Haverfords' townhouse, where a trunk sat packed in the front hall and a hired carriage waited at the curb. He found Helena in the garden, seated on a stone bench beneath a budding chestnut tree. She wore a traveling cloak of dove gray, and her face was calm, the same calm she had worn on the night they first met, when she had faced down cruelty with nothing but words. She looked up as he approached, and he saw that her eyes were not cold. They were sad and weary, and still holding the faintest thread of hope. "I am leaving for the country," she said. "My aunt's hospitality has run its course, and I have no desire to remain where I am not welcome." "You are welcome," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "You are more welcome than I have ever made you feel. Helena, I have been a fool, a proud, blind, stubborn fool. I thought I could protect everyone by controlling everything, and I nearly lost the one person who taught me how wrong I was." He did something then that he had never done before any living soul. He knelt. On the damp grass of a modest garden, the Duke of Ashford lowered himself to one knee and took her gloved hand in his. "I'm not kneeling to propose," he said, and the rawness in his voice made Helena's breath catch. "I am kneeling to apologize, to thank you, to tell you that you were right, about Margaret, about me, about the cost of hesitation. I have been a duke longer than I have been a man, and I forgot what it meant to care without calculating. You reminded me. You who had every reason to turn away, stood firm. You defended my sister when I was not looking. You faced down a scoundrel with nothing but your courage. And you walked away from me when I failed you, because you knew your own worth." He lifted his eyes to hers. They were bright and unguarded and entirely human. "I love you, Helena Thornton, not because you are extraordinary, though you are, but because you are good, because you see clearly and act rightly, even when it costs you. And if you can forgive me, if you can trust me after all I have done and failed to do, I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of you." The garden was quiet. The distant rumble of the carriage seemed very far away. Helena looked down at this man, proud, arrogant, humbled, and felt the last wall around her heart give way. "I do not need you to be worthy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to be present, to see me, even when the ballroom is crowded, to stand with me, even when the whispers rise. Can you promise me that?" "I can," he said. I will, I swear it. She drew him to his feet, her hands gentle on his. Then I am not leaving after all. The smile that broke across his face was like sunlight through storm clouds, unfamiliar, transforming, achingly sincere. He drew her into his arms, and she let herself be held, let herself be seen, let herself belong. Epilogue 1 year later. The gardens of Ashford Hall blazed with summer roses, their petals a riot of cream and crimson against the ancient stone. Lady Margaret, now Lady Margaret Finch, having married the steadfast Mr. Theodore Finch in a ceremony that made the Tun smile with genuine warmth, sat on a blanket beneath the chestnut trees, her infant daughter gurgling in her arms. Helena, the Duchess of Ashford, knelt beside her, pressing a kiss to the baby's downy head. "She has your stubborn chin," Margaret said. "And your brother's appalling timing," Helena replied, glancing toward the house where the Duke was meant to join them, and was, as usual, delayed by some estate matter. Margaret laughed. "He is better, though. You have made him better." Helena watched a butterfly drift across the roses. "He made himself better. I simply refuse to let him be less." The Duke emerged from the house then, his stride long and easy, his cravat slightly askew in a way that would have horrified his former self. He reached his wife's side and bent to kiss her temple, a gesture so unthinkingly tender that Margaret smiled and looked away. "Am I forgiven for my tardiness?" he murmured. "Always," Helena said, "but you will make it up to me with a walk through the rose garden." A heavy penance. He offered his arm and she took it. They walked in comfortable silence, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Helena thought of the ballroom where she had once stood invisible, and the moment she had stepped forward. She thought of the letters, the terrace, the scandal, the kneeling man. And she thought of the quiet truth she had learned, that being seen was not about brilliance or beauty. It was about refusing to vanish when the world expected you to fade. The Duke pressed her hand against his side. "What are you thinking?" "That I am glad I went to that ball," she said, "and that I wore lavender." He laughed, a full, warm sound she had learned to treasure, and drew her closer. The roses nodded in the breeze, and the future stretched before them, steady and bright as summer itself.